Good afternoon, Your Honors. This is case number IT 9834T, the prosecutor versus Naletilić and Martinović.
Thank you very much. For the sake of the record, could we have the appearances, please? For the prosecution?
Good afternoon, Mr. President, Your Honor, Judge Clark, Your Honor, Judge Diarra. Kenneth Scott appearing for the prosecutor, together with Mr. Douglas Stringer, Mr. Vasily Poyavov, Rulam Bos, Marie Ursula Kend, and Kimberly Fleming. Thank you.
Thank you very much. For the accused?
Good afternoon, Your Honors, Mr. President, Judge Diarra, Judge Clark, Krešimir Krsnik as a lead counsel, and Mr. Christopher Mick as a co-counsel, and Mika Pinter as a legal assistant.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, Your Honors, Judge Clark, Judge Diarra. My name is Branko Šerić. I'm a member of the Croatian Bar, and I am the defense counsel for Vinko Martinović. I'm assisted by my co-counsel, Želimir Pab, who's also a lawyer and a member of the Croatian Bar. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Naletilić, can you hear the proceedings in the language that you understand?
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you. You may sit down, please. Mr. Martinović, can you hear the proceedings in a language that you understand?
No.
Yes, I can.
We haven't seen you for about 5 months. Do you have anything to complain? How about your health?
Dobre.
It's fine.
You may sit down, please. Trial Chamber 1, Section A, is sitting today to deliver the judgment in the trial of Vinko Martinović and Mladen Naletilić. For the purpose of this hearing, the Chamber will summarize briefly its findings, emphasizing that it is a summary only, and that only authoritative account of the trial chamber's findings and of its reasons for those findings are to be found in a written judgment, copies of which will be made available to the parties and to the public at the conclusion of this hearing. Before turning to the merits, the Chamber wishes to thank the legal supporting team, the translators and the interpreters, the court management section, the securities, as well as the victim and witness section for having facilitated the conduct of this trial. Now I turn to Judge Diarra.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. The indictment concerned events alleged to have occurred between April 1993 and January 1994. In the course of a conflict between the army of Bosnia and Herzegovina and the Croatian Defence Council in the southwestern part of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and in particular in Mostar and the surrounding municipalities. The prosecution alleged that this conflict was international in nature and that the alleged crimes were part of a widespread, large-scale or systematic attack directed against the Bosnian Muslim population. The accused Mladen Naletilić and Vinko Martinović have been charged to have committed crimes against humanity, grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions of 1949, and violations of the laws or customs of war in their positions of commanders of the Convicts Battalion and of the Vinko Skrobo ATG, respectively. They are charged with both direct and command responsibility under Articles 7.1 and 7.3 of the Statute. More specifically, the accused, Mladen Naletilić, stood trial on the following charges. 1. Persecution on political, racial, and religious grounds for having subjected Bosnian Muslim civilians to unlawful confinement, forcible transfer, mistreatments, unlawful labor, as well as for having destroyed and plundered Bosnian Muslim property. 2. Inhumane acts, inhumane treatment, cruel treatment, unlawful labor, murder and willful killing for having forced Bosnian Muslim detainees to perform dangerous or unlawful labor, sometimes knowingly exposing them to a high likelihood of death or serious injury. Counts 2 to 8. 3. Torture, cruel treatment, and willfully causing great suffering or serious injury to body or health as a result of the mistreatments committed against Bosnian Muslim civilians and prisoners of war. Counts 9 to 12. 4. Unlawful transfer of civilians for having commanded or ordered the forcible transfer of Bosnian Muslim civilians following the attack on the villages of Sovići and Doljani on the 17th of April 1993, and in the course of the conflict in Mostar between the 9th of May 1993 and January 1994. Count 18. 5. Extensive destruction of property and wanton destruction not justified by military necessity for the destruction of Bosnian Muslim property following the attacks on Sovići, Doljani, Mostar and Raštani between April and September 1993. Counts 19 to 20. 6. Plunder of public or private property following the attacks on Sovići, Doljani, Mostar and Raštani between April and September 1993. Count 21. And 7. Seizure, destruction or willful damage done to institutions dedicated to religion for having ordered the destruction of the Mosque of Sovići following the attack on the village. Count 22. A total of 17 counts are held against him. The accused Vinko Martinović stood trial on the following charges. 1. Persecution on political, racial and religious grounds for having subjected Bosnian Muslim civilians to unlawful confinement, forcible transfer, mistreatments, unlawful labor, as well as for having destroyed and plundered Bosnian Muslim property. Count 1. 2. Inhumane acts, inhumane treatment, cruel treatment, unlawful labor, murder and willful killing for having forced Bosnian Muslim detainees to perform dangerous or unlawful labor, sometimes knowingly exposing them to a high likelihood of death or serious injury. Counts 2 to 8. 3. Cruel treatment and willfully causing great suffering or serious injury to body or health as a result of the mistreatments committed against Bosnian Muslim civilians and prisoners of war. Counts 9 to 12. 4. Murder and willful killing of the detainee Nenad Harmandzic in July 1993, while he was under the responsibility of the Vinko Skrobo ATG in Mostar, or alternatively, cruel treatment and willfully causing great suffering or serious injury to body or health to Nenad Harmandzic, who was allegedly subjected to severe beatings by subordinates of the accused. Counts 13 to 17. 5. Unlawful transfer of civilians for having commanded or ordered the forcible transfer of Bosnian Muslim civilians in the course of the conflict in Mostar between the 9th of May 1993 and January 1994. Count 18. 6. Plunder of public or private property following the attack on Mostar on the 9th of May 1993. Count 21. A total of 18 counts are held against him. Following the presentation of the prosecution case and pursuant to Rule 98 bis of the rules, the Chamber found that no or insufficient evidence had been presented concerning the incidents described in paragraphs 42 and 47 of the indictment, respectively relating to the alleged death of prisoners as a direct result of their use as human shields on the 17th of September 1993, and to the alleged mistreatment of witness B in the base of the KB in Široki Brijeg. The trial commenced on the 10th of September 2001 and concluded on the 31st of October 2002. The Chamber heard a total of 84 witnesses for the prosecution, 35 for the Naletilic defense and 27 for the Martinovic defense. Throughout the trial, approximately 2,750 exhibits were admitted. The Chamber will now summarize its findings on the charges held against both accused.
To Judge Clark.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ladies and gentlemen, long after this tribunal has determined its last case, historians and political scholars will continue to debate and theorize the genesis and causes of the wars in the former Yugoslavia. This is not our task, and we have steered a course away from formulating any theories of our own or findings as to the causes of the war. Our duty as judges of the International Tribunal is to determine whether the case brought by the prosecution against Mladen Naletilić, Tuta, or Vinko Martinović, Stella, is proved. The events surrounding the accusations against Naletilić and Martinović took place in southwestern Herzegovina, the southmost portion of Bosnia and Herzegovina. This is the only case so far to deal with this particular region. Traditionally, southern Herzegovina was the home to a large number of inhabitants who declared themselves as Croats and who shared the Catholic faith and traditions of their neighbors in Croatia. Considering the geographic position of the two countries, this is not at all surprising. The same area was also home to a significant number of Muslims who shared no religious ties with Croatia. Both groups of people speak the same language, with regional and traditional variations in accent and some vocabulary. The capital of this area of Herzegovina was the ancient and lovely Ottoman city of Mostar, with a culturally diverse population of Croats, Muslims, Serbs, Jews, and others. In the upheaval and tearing apart, which followed the expression of national and ethnic identity, which occurred throughout the regions of the former Yugoslavia from 1990 onwards, the control of Mostar and the adjacent areas played an important and profoundly tragic part. no people escaped the effects of this episode of history. Prior to the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, Mostar was an ethnically diverse city, with areas within the city which were enclaves of Serbs, Croats or Muslims. For the most part, however, the city was ethnically mixed, with a long history of tolerance. This is evidenced by the presence of Franciscan monasteries, Orthodox churches, a Roman Catholic cathedral, convents, a synagogue, and 19 mosques, which had survived many centuries of political change, including more than 40 years of single-party socialist rule. The city is divided by the fast-flowing Neretva River. The older and more historic part of the city is on the east bank, and was traditionally the more Muslim and Serb end of the town. The eastern side was during the Serb conflict, and then the Croat-Muslim War, subjected to merciless bombardment, and is now in a state of ruin. The painfully beautiful old arched bridge, which stood over the Neretva River for 4 centuries, was blasted and finally destroyed in November 1993. Although Mostar and the surrounding region was the battleground of several conflicts between the different groups in the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, this judgment deals only with the short period running from April 1993 to March 1994. The indictment deals only with the conflict between the BH Croats and Muslims. These two ethnic groups had cooperated and fought jointly in 1992 in the Serb-Montenegrin conflict. Sadly, many factors, the rights and wrongs of which it is not our task to adjudicate, led to a bitter conflict, and Mostar itself became a divided city, with the ABIH on the east side and the HVO on the western part. The war was hard and brutal. In dealing with the background to the allegations in this case, this trial chamber has noted a strange uniformity in the description of these tragic events from all the witnesses called. The war with the Serbs is always referred to as the Serb aggression or the Serb and Montenegrin aggression. But the conflict between the HVO and the ABIH, or between the Serbs and between the Croats and the Muslims, is always referred to as the war. The disappearance of more than 20% of the population of the city following the Serb withdrawal in mid-1992 elicited no regret or adverse comment from witnesses. Many defense witnesses testified that it was the constitutional duty of Croatia to protect Croats throughout the world, and therefore the Croats in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Counsel for the defense of Naletilić and witnesses called on his behalf asserted that there was no such thing as a Bosnian Croat. There were only Croats from Bosnia and Herzegovina. Many defense witnesses objected strongly to this description. Yet the same witnesses frequently, no doubt inadvertently, used the description Bosnian Croat themselves. There was objection to the use of the name Bosnia to describe the country. There is no doubt that some of the country is indeed called Bosnia, and some of the country is traditionally Herzegovina, and the whole entity is known as Bosnia and Herzegovina. A country enjoying such an unfortunately long name is described almost universally by its shortened name Bosnia. We heard the testimony of witnesses against such a background of sensitivities. For the purposes of this judgment, therefore, we propose to refer to the participants as BH Croats, Muslims, and BH Serbs. Croat simpliciter refers to citizens of the Republic of Croatia. As mentioned previously, the scene of the accusations is Herzegovina, in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Many witnesses did their best to recount painful events from 8 or 9 years ago. Sometimes, however, the level of untruthful testimony presented was disappointing. Some witnesses exaggerated the facts. Some were economical with the truth, and some told deliberate untruths. It has been disappointing to note the frequency with which well-positioned witnesses saw nothing, heard nothing, and knew nothing of important events in their local area. It is accepted that in a bitter inter-ethnic conflict, the same events can and frequently are described in quite different and sometimes irreconcilable ways. The trial chamber allows for this possibility. The trial chamber excludes this slant or interpretation of the evidence in the assessment of witnesses who were untruthful. Our comments refer to witnesses who presented untruthful testimony quite deliberately and not from a genuine, although objectively misconceived perception of events. At all stages, we have approached the evidence from the premise that the prosecution must carry the burden of truth, and that any reasonable doubt raised must inure to the benefit of the accused. Because of the continuing mistrust between the two communities with divided loyalties, unless we found consistency between the evidence of independent sources and the evidence of participants, we rejected that evidence as unreliable. Almost 150 witnesses were heard, and a very large volume of documents were presented for the trial chamber's consideration. Documents play a key role in this trial. The vast bulk of the documents came from the HVO archive, which is retained in Zagreb. These included some of the records from the Heliodrome prison or camp, which document the daily releases of prisoners to work for named units of the HVO and the HV. The HVO archives are a careful, meticulous, military-style recording of army reports and orders, and equally carefully prepared reports and orders of the civilian administration of the HVO government. The Chamber also received daily reports and weekly summaries from international observers and from humanitarian organizations. The Chamber also received documents which were seized from the headquarters of the Kazanika Bojna in Široki Brijeg pursuant to a search warrant. These documents confirmed much of the evidence received from 7 previous members of the KB and leave no doubt as to the position of Mladen Naletilić tutor as Supreme Commander of the KB. The Chamber also received the humble diary of a careful and observant man who recorded in a pre-used notebook the daily happenings of the HVO command at Orlovac at the old fish farm outside Doljani. This diary records in some detail the comings and goings of Tuta during the period material to the accusations relating to Sovici and Doljani. In spite of efforts by the defense to minimize the diarist's role in the HVO or to deny his presence at the fish farm, the Chamber is satisfied that this diary is a genuine and reliable document. The Chamber ordered that a photocopy be made of the original diary and a translation be made of this photocopy and compared with the original presented to the Chamber through the witness who had retained it for many years. The Chamber has no doubt as to the authenticity of this diary, which is not to say that the contents of the diary are necessarily true. The diary represents what the writer recorded of events as they occurred to him, and has corroborated the testimony of other witnesses as to their treatment when brought as captured prisoners to the fish farm. It has also assisted the Naletilic defense in placing Tuta and Doljani on the 19th of April 1993 and not before that. A small number of documents were received from the Muslim component of the government of Bosnia and Herzegovina. For the most part, these documents were taken from the same HVO command at the fish farm in Orlovac when the ABIH overran Doljani in July of 1993. This is how the Radoš diary came to the attention of the chamber, which saw and examined the original. All the documents indicate an extraordinary consistency with testimony of witnesses and provided corroboration in contested issues. Having made those preliminary comments, we return to the subject matter of this trial. Mladen Naletilić is aged 56 and was born on the 1st of December 1946 in Široki Brijeg, Bosnia and Herzegovina. Nicknames are a common feature with witnesses in this case, to the extent that many persons were known only by their nickname to the loss of their family identity. Mladen Naletilić has the nickname Tuta, and indeed was known by many witnesses only as Tuta, Mr. Tuta, or General Tuta. The accused often signed documents using only this name and other documents as Mladen Naletilić Tuta. Hence this nickname, Tuta, as one of the accused. Široki Brijeg is 14 kilometers west of Mostar. It is on the main route from Mostar to the Croatian border, the sea or the Adriatic coast, and approximately 40 kilometers from Doljani and Sovici. By all accounts, Široki Brijeg is an exclusively Roman Catholic town with a population of less than 30,000 people. For its size, Široki Brijeg plays a surprisingly large part in this case, being the birthplace of Mladen Naletilić and the birthplace or habitual residence of a very large number of witnesses called by the Naletilić defense. The evidence in relation to where Tuta lived and worked before he returned to live in Široki Brijeg is unclear. There have been oblique references to his wealth, his villa with landscaping and swimming pool in a terrain with no water supply, his being driven in an expensive car surrounded by bodyguards. For an extended period of his life, he lived outside Herzegovina in Germany and returned to Široki Brijeg to live and build a villa in the early 1990s. He appears to have been a generous donor to the citizens of Široki Brijeg, supporting the town's religious and supporting activities while living and working abroad. In 1991, Tuta was in his mid-40s. He is a slightly built man given to wearing longish hair. Photographs taken of him during the period of the conflict show a light-framed man with glasses, a beard, and longish graying hair. He does not present as the usual military commander. Before he returned to Široki Brijeg in 1990 or 91, he had already set up an independent paramilitary group known as the Convicts Battalion, KB, or Kazinajka Bonja, with the knowledge and approval of Dr. Franjo Tuđman. This group was described as a special purposes unit engaged in sabotage and infiltrating enemy lines. Under the leadership and tutelage of Mladen Naletilić and his close associate Ivan Andabak, the small group grew in popularity and legend, becoming for its fans the group which was instrumental in the defeat of the Serbs and the liberation of Mostar in the spring of 1992. The breakup of Yugoslavia and single-party rule produced a period of extreme lawlessness. Defense counsel for Mr. Naletilić described the early days of the conflicts between the different ethnic groups in Mostar as where every man who had a weapon was a soldier, every man who had enough money could buy weapons and uniforms to set up a unit and call himself commander. In spite of the arms embargo, it seems that for the BH Croats, weapons and uniforms were readily available. Later, this became the situation for almost all citizens. After the Serb withdrawal, Tuta, who enjoyed somewhat of a cult status, being described over and over again by witnesses as a legend. In the meanwhile, the Convicts Battalion grew in numbers and engaged in continuing combat against the BH Serbs and the forces of the JNA until June of 1992, to emerge again under the HVO umbrella in early skirmishes against the BH Muslim forces in late 92 or early 93. Tuta was a close friend and associate of Gojko Šušak, Minister of Defense in the government of Croatia, thus affording a line of communication to President Franjo Tuđman. He was associated with Mate Boban, President of the HDZ in BH and President of the HZ-HB. There is no evidence to show that he was a member of the HDZ, nor that he was a member of the government of HZ-HB or the subsequent HR-HB. The defense deny that he played any role during the war and deny that he was the commander of the Convicts Battalion. But we are satisfied that he was a man of influence and importance in the affairs of the Croatian community of Herzegovina. He was in a position to negatively affect the lives of the BH Muslims during the war. Vinko Martinović Stella is aged 39 and was born on the 21st of September 1963 in Mostar, Bosnia and Herzegovina. He was brought up in an ethnically diverse area of Mostar called Rodoč. He grew up, worked and lived in close association with Muslims. Prior to the war, he had mostly been engaged as a taxi driver in Mostar. Many of the witnesses, including his brother and some neighbors, described him as a natural-born leader and a patriot. In 1992, when the conflict in Mostar started against the Serb-Montenegrin army, Vinko Martinović, at the age of 29, joined the HOS, a paramilitary group of BH Croats and Muslims, where he became the commander of the Mostar battalion. He was never engaged politically. He was a local Mostar boy with a basic education. Following the breakdown of relations between BH Muslims and BH Croats, HOS was dissolved and Vinko Martinović became the commander of an anti-terrorist group, an ATG of the HVO called Vinko Skrobo or Mrmak. This small group was part of the Convicts Battalion, although for the most part they led a fairly independent existence. Vinko Martinović, who carries the nickname Stella, appears to have prospered as such leader and to have gathered to himself a group of like-minded young men. It is an unfortunately sad fact of life that in wartime, groups of mean-spirited profiteers and bullies frequently emerge. Under the guise of a uniform and the safety of arms and numbers, they proclaim themselves commanders and take over areas to the disadvantage of other citizens and to the benefit of themselves. Vinko Martinović is an example of those who prosper during war. He rose from a taxi driver to a commander. When he first appeared before the tribunal, he described himself as a restaurant owner. Throughout the trial, he was presented as a simple foot soldier doing his best to protect his town and area from attack. The 22 counts in the indictment are alleged to have occurred during an international armed conflict and partial occupation of the Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina. These crimes are alleged to have been perpetrated by the Convicts Battalion with the armed forces of the HVO, who the prosecution alleges were backed and supported by the HV, in the municipalities of Mostar and Jablanica. It is alleged that Mladen Naletilić Tuta commanded the Convicts Battalion, or KB, within the HVO from its headquarters in Široki Brijeg, and that Vinko Martinović Stella commanded a subunit, a so-called anti-terrorist group, an ATG of the Convicts Battalion, known as Mrmak and later named Vinko Skrobo, on the front line in Mostar. The prosecution alleges that on the 17th of April 1993, the HV and the HVO, including the Convicts Battalion, under the overall command of Mladen Naletilić Tuta, participated in attacks on Sovici and Doljani, two villages in the municipality of Jablanica. During this operation, the BH Muslim population were forcibly removed from these villages and their houses and mosque were destroyed. The first part of our findings of fact will therefore relate to these two villages, whether the events occurred within an international armed conflict and whether Mladen Naletilić Tutor was the leader of the KB at the time, and whether he was in overall control of the Soviet-Dolyani military operation. The prosecution further alleges that on the 9th of May 1993, forces of the HV and the HVO, including the Convicts Battalion, and the Mermak, later Vinko Skrobo, participated in launching a large military offensive against the BH Muslim population in the town of Mostar, provoking the separation of Mostar along the confrontation line, dividing the city between Croats and Muslims. In the closing arguments of the Naletilic defense, the trial chamber was addressed on the writings of a professor of law and anthropology, who it was alleged had written that this tribunal delivers justice that is biased with prosecutorial decisions based on national characteristics of the accused, rather than on the available evidence indicating what he has done. The trial chamber was also reminded of the Kupreskić decision of the appeal chamber, which reversed the findings of the trial chamber and acquitted the accused, and urged us to apply the same principles outlined in that appeal judgment. This trial chamber can assure the parties that we have heard and given deep consideration to all the very many worthy representations made by defense and prosecution counsel. In many instances, both of the accused shared witnesses and adopted similar legal arguments. There was no serious difference between them as to issues argued. Both parties took the position that every material fact was denied and that all facts were in issue. Although Vinko Martinović in his pre-trial brief accepted that he was the commander of the Vinko Skrobo ATG during the relevant period, at trial he appeared to have resigned from this position, and witnesses who had previously been prisoners at the Heliodrome prison were frequently cross-examined as to visual identification of Stella, his headquarters at Kalimova Street or the front line at the boulevard. The main thrust of Mladen Naletilic's defense was that he was not the commander of the KB and that the commander was Ivan Andabak. During the defense case, after more than 50 witnesses had been cross-examined, and after 7 defense witnesses had presented their evidence, the defense became more specific. For the first time, the chamber heard that Mladen Naletilić had resigned from the KB in the early autumn months of 1992 due to failing health, and that he therefore was not responsible, either as a superior or as a perpetrator, of any of the accounts charged. Clearly, if the prosecution cannot prove beyond reasonable doubt that Mladen Naletilić Tutor was the commander of the KB in April 1993 to January 1994, then all counts against him fail and he must be acquitted. Such a finding would not affect the counts against Vinko Martinović Stella, although of course the rejection of much of the evidence against Naletilić would well affect the credibility of witnesses who gave evidence concerning the role of both accused. Before dealing specifically with each count on the indictment, it is proposed to make factual findings on the chronological sequence of events which form the basis for specific charges. Witnesses and documents in this case deal mainly with first the background to the conflict, the involvement of the Republic of Croatia to the conflict, the military picture of the Convicts Battalion within the HVA structures, and the locations of the crimes charged. The accused have been charged with grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions, as included in Article 2 of the Statute. The jurisdictional prerequisites, therefore, are that the conflict must be international by the intervention of another state in that conflict through direct deployment of its troops, or by indirect intervention so as to exercise overall control over one of the parties to the conflict. The victims of the alleged crimes must be protected persons. The circumstances leading up to the conflict between the HVO and the ABIH in this part of Herzegovina differ little, if at all, from the factual and historical backdrop of 2 other cases already dealt with by this tribunal. These are the prosecutor versus Blaskic and the prosecutor versus Kordic and Cherkes, Those judgments were delivered on the 3rd of March 2000 and the 26th of February 2001. Although both of these cases involved the conflict between the HVIO and the ABIH in the area of the Lashva Valley, the essential ingredients relating to jurisdictional prerequisites are identical. The location of the crimes alleged in this case and in Blaskic and Kordic is all within the separate self-proclaimed Herzegovina. As in those two cases, there is ample evidence of deployment of Croatian army troops and equipment in the area of Herzegovina during the period of this indictment. Many, many victims and prisoners who were witnesses in this case had daily sightings of soldiers wearing HV uniforms, driving HV vehicles, and occupying separate areas of the heliodrome, a former JNA military barracks, used during the conflict for the detention of prisoners of war and other mainly Muslim detainees. These troops appeared to fight in separate units under separate commands, thereby belying the defense claim that they were for the most part volunteers of Herzegovinian origin who had taken up arms against the Serbs for Croatia and after that conflict had returned to protect their homes from ABIH attack. This same defense has been argued and rejected in the Blaskic and Kordic cases and has equally been rejected by this trial chamber. The sheer volume of testimony and documents recording the presence and participation of HV troops from reliable independent sources and the HVO archives leaves little doubt on this question. There is ample evidence of Croatia's attempts to conceal its direct involvement in the conflict in Bosnia and Herzegovina from the documents presented during the trial and referred to as the presidential transcripts. These documents were first the subject of debate during the last stages of the trial of Dario Kordic, the former senior political ruler of Herzegovina. The trial chamber heard evidence as to the technical details of the taping and subsequent transcription of conversations at meetings which took place in President Tudjman's office. The trial chamber received that testimony under Rule 92 bis and was assisted in matters relating to the examination of this extremely valuable archive by Mr. Marko Perlic. This is the first trial chamber to rely on the contents of this portion of the presidential transcripts, which were immensely helpful in highlighting unambiguous evidence of President Tudjman's deep involvement in the affairs of Herzegovina, the HVO, and the conflict in Bosnia and Herzegovina. The findings which follow, therefore, are made in the context of an international armed conflict. The trial chamber finds that Mladen Naletilić tutor was one of the main commanders of the plan to take Sovici and Doljani as part of an overall plan to take Jablanica, a predominantly Muslim town which resisted being included in a Croat-dominated Herzegovina. Ivan Andabak and Mario Hakac, known as Chikota, were with him as commanders of the KB units. In April 1993, the Jablanica area was in a state of readiness for conflict on both sides, and acts of provocation, manipulation of media reports, and gross exaggeration of mutual fears were common. The arrival of large numbers of Muslim refugees from the Serb conflict into Jablanica upset the ethnic balance and contributed to heightened tensions. There were troop movements of both sides in the area, and roadblocks were a common occurrence after the 15th of April. The local Muslim population was less unprepared than witnesses were prepared to admit. The chamber has no function in determining the rights and wrongs in the overall political situation which prevailed in the larger conflict. This trial chamber does not minimize or condone the subsequent military activity in the village of Doljani, where it is agreed that atrocities took place in July of the same year. The trial chamber finds that in the local conflict which ensued in Sovici and Doljani, Mladen Naletilić was instrumental in the gross mistreatment of some of the captured soldiers loyal to the ABIH and in the mistreatment of the civilian population and their property.